Hi everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name's Timothy. I raised my daughters alone. Their mother left us after saying this wasn't the life she wanted anymore. I didn't have time to sit around, so I picked up the pieces and built a life around them. Then years down the line, she came back, but with a new husband. And one day, the girls came to me and told me he wanted to adopt them. I told them that I won't stand in their way. But life has a funny way of circling back. They came back, and they weren't expecting the version of me they found. They didn't expect what I had to say. Here's how everything happened. Gabrielle, the mother of my girls, and me met in high school. We were each other's whole world back then. When we graduated, everything changed. Gabrielle got accepted into college. I was proud of her genuinely, but I didn't apply to college. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't afford it. My parents were already drowning in bills, and the idea of taking on student loans just felt like jumping into a deeper hole. So, I made a decision to stay behind and started working just to make sure my family stayed afloat. We stayed in touch the whole time she was away at school. Every phone call, every visit, and every text kept our love alive, even with the miles between us. Gabrielle's parents were able to support her. They paid for her tuition, helped her with rent, and made sure she could focus fully on her studies. I was happy for her, but deep down, I knew we were living in two different worlds. When she graduated, a great job offer came in right away from a large company that had a branch right in our hometown. She came back home, and for a moment, it felt like things were aligning again. She was back, and we could finally start building our life together in the same city. We were still in love, so we moved in together. But living together changes things. All the quirks you didn't notice before, you start seeing. Habits you could ignore from a distance start becoming irritants when you're sharing a bathroom, a kitchen, or a bed. We were adjusting to each other's rhythms, and not always gracefully. She was used to structure and plans. I was used to adjusting and surviving. She wanted a Pinterest life, but I was still figuring out how to keep the lights on. Looking back, moving in together wasn't the fresh start we hoped it would be. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling. But at the time, I didn't see it that way. I still believed we were strong enough to make it work. I thought love was enough. But love isn't always enough when two people are walking in different directions. A few months after we moved in together, Gabrielle found out she was pregnant. It came as a shock to both of us. Neither of us had planned for kids. We were still figuring out how to manage the realities of adulthood. And then boom, a pregnancy test flipped our world upside down. From that moment, the atmosphere shifted. You'd think a pregnancy might bring people closer, especially people who had known each other since they were teenagers. But it didn't. If anything, it created a wall between us. Gabrielle started acting differently, becoming cold, distant, and sometimes even hostile. It was like she resented me for getting her pregnant, and it was all my fault. I tried to be supportive. I tried to talk through our options and what we were going to do, but every conversation turned into an argument. We weren't on the same page. I wanted to be there for her, but I could also feel that she was pulling away. We talked about whether we were ready to be parents over and over again. And every single time, we ended up yelling, walking out of the room, slamming doors. There was no middle ground. We just couldn't agree on how to go about things. I was scared, but I was willing. I wanted to take responsibility. She, on the other hand, kept talking about how much this would derail her future and how she hadn't worked this hard just to end up tied down. Eventually, she made the decision. She was going to keep the baby. And just when I thought we had finally settled that, the doctor told us we were going to have twins. 2 girls. I knew then that we were in for a long road. From that point on, I made it my mission to make sure Gabrielle lacked nothing. I picked up extra shifts. I started budgeting every dollar. I ran grocery errands, cooked, cleaned, and took on whatever role I had to just to make the load easier for her. She wasn't the easiest to deal with, but I didn't care. When the girls were finally born, for a brief window of time, it felt like we were working as a team. We talked more. We laughed once in a while. We took turns feeding and rocking the girls. That was the moment we decided, let's get married. We figured maybe a deeper commitment would make things more stable, give us a solid foundation to build on. When Gabrielle and I got married, I think part of me hoped that the old spark would find its way back. But it didn't. Emotionally, we were miles apart. It felt like we were just coexisting, doing what was expected of us, without actually being in it together. Gabrielle would often bring up how different her life could have been if she hadn't married me. At first, she'd say it jokingly, with a smile. But as the months turned into years, the jokes turned into full-blown arguments. And those arguments? They usually came around whenever the topic of money surfaced. I was doing my best, but it never felt like enough. According to her, I had become the thing that stood between her and the version of herself she wanted to be. She'd say things like, I could have been someone by now if I hadn't settled for this. By the time the twins turned 6, it wasn't just tension in the house anymore. It was a full rupture. One evening, Gabrielle sat me down and said she wanted a divorce. I still remember her exact words. She said, I need to find myself. I wasn't made for this kind of life. It was like she had already checked out emotionally long before she said the words out loud. What shocked me more than the divorce itself was what came after. She didn't fight for the girls. She simply said, you can keep them. I know they'll be safe with you. And then she left. At first, she made the occasional effort to see them. A phone call here, a brief weekend visit there. But that slowly faded, like everything else. 1 month turned into 3, then 6. Eventually, the girls stopped asking when mommy was coming. It wasn't until much later that I found out the full story. Gabrielle had landed a job offer in New York. A big opportunity. I now have 2 little girls looking up at me, and in that moment, it was up to me to make sure they get the best life ever. Once Gabrielle left, I quit the second physical job I had and replaced it with a remote evening gig that paid less but gave me an opportunity to always be and spend more valuable time with my daughters. That change didn't make things easier. I was their father, yes, but I was also playing the role of mother, friend, protector, and counselor. And I gave it my all, even when I felt like I had nothing left to give. There were nights when I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but I'd still sit at the edge of their beds and listen to them talk about their day. There were mornings I skipped breakfast just to make sure they had lunch money. I wore the same pair of shoes for years, so they could have new ones for school. But through all of it, I never once badmouthed Gabrielle. I didn't fill their heads with bitterness. When they asked why she never called, never visited, I just said she wasn't ready. But I'm here. I'll always be here. Over time, our bond grew stronger every day. Every Sunday night, we had pancake dinners. Every birthday, I wrote them letters about the year gone by. They didn't just feel loved. They knew they were safe, wanted, and prioritized. One Father's Day, when they were about 10, they surprised me with a homemade scrapbook. The cover read, My Hero, My Dad. Inside were drawings, handwritten notes, photos, and memories. One page read, You're our superhero because you never gave up on us. I had to step outside so they wouldn't see the tears rolling down my face. It was one of the few times I allowed myself to cry. Single fatherhood is not something I ever asked for. But those girls gave my life meaning. Every tired morning, every quiet worry about money, every lonely evening was worth it. And in return, I got something most men never do. I got to watch love grow with no conditions. That chapter of our lives wasn't easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. 11 years had passed since Gabrielle walked away from our family, and I honestly didn't expect to see her again, not at an important moment like my daughter's graduation. But there she was. What surprised me more was that she wasn't alone. She had a husband with her, a man who seemed well-mannered and confident. I later found out he was wealthy and successful. Gabrielle didn't say much to me that day, but she did speak with the girls afterward and invited them to dinner at their home. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to protect my daughters and keep them close, but another part of me knew I couldn't control their choices anymore. They were no longer little girls. They were young women starting to make their own decisions. In the weeks and months that followed, my daughters started spending more time at their mother's house. It wasn't hard to see why. Their mother and her husband lived in a beautiful, spacious suburban home, with everything neat and polished, far beyond what I could provide in our modest place. I could understand why they'd be drawn there. The house had a kind of quiet comfort and stability I struggled to give them. Then one evening, they sat me down to have a serious talk. I could tell they were nervous, but also sure about what they wanted to say. They told me Gabrielle's husband wanted to adopt them. They said he had already spoken to a lawyer about it, and that the process was moving forward. They reassured me it wasn't because they didn't love me or appreciate everything I had done. They believed this adoption would give them a better future, a chance to be part of a family that felt more complete, more secure. Hearing that was painful, but I knew getting angry or pleading wouldn't change their minds. Instead, I looked at them and said quietly, "If you believe this is what you want, then I won't stand in your way." I wanted them to know I love them no matter what, even if it hurt me deeply. The adoption went through. My daughters officially became part of their stepfather's family. They moved out completely to live with him and their mother. Watching them leave was harder than I thought. I sold the house we had shared and moved to a different part of town. It felt like closing a chapter one wasn't ready to close, but I knew I had to. For the first time in years, I didn't have to carry the weight of providing for my daughters all alone. I didn't have to work double shifts or late nights just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. I could finally take a breath and think about myself. At first, it was strange, but slowly, I started to rebuild my life in ways I hadn't allowed myself to before. One thing I hadn't touched in a long time was the idea of love. When Gabrielle left, I buried myself and my kids because they needed me. I didn't have room for anyone else, nor did I want to risk getting hurt again. But now, with the girls grown and living their own lives, I found myself open to meeting new people, exploring what a relationship could be without all the baggage from before. This wasn't about replacing what I had with Gabrielle or what I'd had with my daughters. It was about finally letting myself live again. I wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. I could focus on healing, on being more than just a dad, on being a man who still had dreams and desires of his own. It was about 2 years after the girls had moved in with their mom and her new husband when I got the news that Gabrielle and that man were getting divorced. You'd think a couple with that kind of money and status would have it all figured out, right? But no, it wasn't perfect. Behind that fancy house and polished smiles, things were far from what they seemed. The girls eventually reached out to me, asking if they could come over and talk. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years apart and all the hurt, I said yes. They're still my daughters. No matter what, that doesn't change. When they came, they didn't hold back. They started telling me about life there. Turns out, the man wasn't the hero they thought he was. He was abusive. At first, they tried to convince themselves it was worth it, that they'd traded a rough life for comfort and safety. But it wasn't just about money or a nice home. It was about feeling safe and loved, and they weren't getting that. What hurt the most was that they realized I never made them feel like a burden. I was there for them day and night through everything. And yet, they had pushed me away for what seemed easier, for the illusion of a better life. Hearing that was painful. I'm not going to lie. It's like watching the foundation you built your life on crumble. But it was also clear to me that this was a moment of truth for all of us. I listened without interrupting or trying to fix things right away. I just let them speak, knowing they needed to say it out loud. I nodded, understanding the weight of their words and the pain they carried. But inside, I felt something shift. I realized that while my love for them hadn't changed one bit, I couldn't just pick up where we left off as if nothing happened. Things couldn't go back to the way they were. When they asked me if we could go back to how things were, I looked each of them in the eye and said, "I still love you. That hasn't changed. But I won't beg to be in your life anymore." I wanted them to understand that love alone isn't enough if respect and trust aren't there too. They begged for forgiveness, pleaded for a second chance. But I had to be firm. I told them, "I gave you everything I had, every day, every sacrifice. and you chose to erase me. I understand that. But I've healed. It wasn't about punishing them or closing the door. It was about protecting myself and setting clear, healthy boundaries. Boundaries I should have set a long time ago when their mother left me the same way. Eventually, they agreed to those terms. They knew they had to meet me halfway. I told them straight, I'm not going to baby you anymore. You're adults now. If you want to be in my life, you have to act like it. No more running away, no more hiding. We all have to face the truth and move forward with honesty. After everything, I took a moment to reflect on everything. I loved my daughters deeply and without conditions. But love isn't just about holding on. Sometimes it means knowing when to step back, to protect your own peace, and to set boundaries that keep you whole. It wasn't easy to let them go when they chose a different path, and it wasn't easy hearing them say the other man fit better with their lives. But I realized that love also means accepting their choices, even if it hurts. I couldn't force them to stay in my world if they didn't want to. And when they came back, asking for me again, I had changed. I had learned that love isn't about begging or clinging to the past. It's about being strong enough to say, I love you, but I won't lose myself trying to hold you. So I want to thank you all for listening. If you're holding on to something or someone and it's hurting you more than helping, maybe it's time to think about healing instead. What would you do if you were in my shoes? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear this, and take care of yourselves out there.